I am Jasmine Lambert, 32, and today I watched my husband Marcus die in a hospital room where no one could understand my signing, and I couldn't hear his last words. After fighting through 36 hours of travel and bureaucratic nightmares to bring his body home, I texted our family group chat, flight delayed. Landing 11 p.m. Need ride, phone dying, can't call Uber. My sister Maya replied, can't pick you up that late. Figure it out. Mom added, why didn't you plan better? We have work tomorrow. With trembling fingers, I typed back no problem while my heart shattered in complete silence. I had no idea that within hours, my family would be watching my tragedy unfold on their evening news. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever felt invisible when you needed someone most. Before grief rewrote my entire existence, I had what most would call a picture-perfect life. Marcus and I met at a deaf community barbecue 7 years ago. I was sitting alone, frustrated after another failed attempt at lip-reading a hearing person's joke, when this tall man with kind eyes approached me. Instead of the awkward pantomiming I was used to from hearing people, his hands moved in fluid, confident ASL, mind if I join you? I'm Marcus, and I promise my signing is better than my grilling skills. His ASL was flawless, with the natural rhythm that only comes from years of practice. I later learned he had become an interpreter after his younger brother was born deaf. We married 2 years later in a ceremony where every word was simultaneously spoken and signed, where both communities, hearing and deaf, could fully participate together. We built a beautiful life in Seattle. I worked as a marketing coordinator for a non-profit supporting deaf youth, while Marcus thrived as a software accessibility consultant, developing technology that bridged communication gaps. Our house was perfectly designed for our bilingual world: visual doorbells, smart lights that flashed for notifications, and a kitchen island where we could cook while maintaining eye contact for conversation. 8 years of marriage passed like a beautiful dream. We traveled whenever possible, hosting weekly game nights where our deaf and hearing friends mixed seamlessly, and saved diligently for our future. Marcus and I had started fertility treatments 6 months earlier. We had already converted the spare bedroom into a home office that could easily become a nursery when the time came. Marcus would often catch me staring at that room, dreaming. Soon, he would sign, pulling me close. Our little one will be lucky to have 2 languages from day one. Everything changed last fall when Marcus was offered a 4-month contract with a German tech company developing accessibility software for the European market. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, one that would establish him as an international leader in his field. I arranged to work remotely for 6 weeks, planning to join him in Berlin for an extended European vacation before his contract ended. The night before his departure, we had a special dinner at home. I still remember every detail. The way candlelight played across Marcus's face as he signed about our future. How his hands painted pictures of the places we would visit together in Germany. 4 months will fly by, he assured me, his fingers dancing through the air in our shared language, and then we start the next chapter with everything we've learned. We video called every day for the first month and a half. Technology made the distance bearable. I could see his animated expressions as he described his colleagues, the projects he was working on, the small apartment he'd rented near the office. During our calls, it felt like he was right there with me, his signing filling my laptop screen with warmth and connection. Then came the call that shattered my world. It was a Tuesday morning, 6 a.m. Seattle time, 3 p.m. in Berlin. Marcus appeared on screen looking tired, rubbing his temples with both hands. Massive headache, he signed, his movements slower than usual. Probably just stress from the presentation deadline. We chatted for another 10 minutes about weekend plans, about the Christmas market he wanted to show me when I visited. Then, mid-sentence, his hands dropped. His eyes went wide with confusion before rolling back. I watched helplessly as my husband collapsed out of frame, his laptop crashing to the floor with him. Marcus! Marcus! I screamed at the screen, my voice raw and desperate, though I couldn't hear it myself. The video feed showed only ceiling, but I could see shadows moving. I frantically texted his phone, sent messages through every app we used, tried calling his office number I had memorized for emergencies. 2 hours later, His colleague Klaus called using Marcus's phone. Through a painful combination of broken English texts and a hastily downloaded translation app, I learned that Marcus had suffered a massive brain aneurysm during our call. He had been rushed to Charit University Hospital and was in surgery. I booked the first available flight, but between connections and delays, the journey took 28 hours. By the time I arrived at the hospital, Marcus was already in a medically induced coma. The damage, doctors explained through Google Translate and hand-drawn diagrams, was catastrophic. For 6 agonizing days, I sat by his hospital bed in a country where no one understood my language. The medical staff were compassionate but overwhelmed by our communication barrier. I carried a pocket notebook, writing questions in broken German and English, receiving answers I could barely comprehend. But I talked to him anyway. My hands moved constantly above his still form, signing stories of our life together, promises about our future, desperate pleas for him to come back to me. I used tactile signing, pressing my hands against his palms, hoping somehow he could feel my words through touch. The nurses watched with puzzled expressions as I conducted these one-sided conversations with my hands. They couldn't understand that for Marcus and me, our hands were our voices, our connection, our most intimate form of communication. Without his eyes to see my signing, without his hands to respond, we were severed from each other in the cruelest way possible. On the 6th day, Marcus's brain activity ceased completely. Through careful translations and gentle gestures from Dr. Mueller, I understood that the machines were the only thing keeping his body functioning. The decision to let him go was mine alone. I held his hand as they turned off the ventilator, signing "I love you" over and over against his palm, hoping that somehow, somewhere, he could feel those words. But there was no gentle goodbye, no final exchange in our shared language. Just the silence of machines stopping and my husband slipping away without ever seeing my last message to him. The nightmare of dealing with a foreign bureaucracy alone was overwhelming. Every form was in German. Every conversation required translation apps or hospital interpreters who weren't always available. I called my family back home daily, desperate for emotional support, but our conversations were brief and frustrating. "We're praying for you," Maya would text before explaining why she couldn't talk long. Mom would send short messages asking if I had thought to call the American consulate. My brother David suggested I hire a local service to handle arrangements so I could come home sooner. But I couldn't leave Marcus. Not like that. Not in a country where he knew only colleagues, not friends who could sign their memories of him at a proper funeral. I stayed and handled everything myself. The death certificate required 3 full days and countless office visits, with me frantically scribbling German phrases copied from Google Translate. Arranging for burial in Berlin, because the costs of transporting his body home were prohibitively expensive, required navigating unfamiliar customs and traditions. The funeral was heartbreakingly small. Some of his colleagues attended, a few expat friends he'd made, and me. No family, no lifelong friends, no one who could share stories in the language Marcus had learned for love. My parents said the flight was too expensive on short notice. Maya had critical work deadlines. David couldn't leave his new baby. I stood alone as they lowered my husband into German soil, a world away from everyone who had watched our love story unfold. The service was conducted entirely in German and English. No one signed a single word. In death, Marcus was surrounded by a language that wasn't ours, by people who had never seen him laugh at my visual puns or watched him fingerspell inside jokes across a crowded room. The financial strain was crushing. Our insurance covered some expenses, but international policies had limitations I'd never examined. I drained our savings and maxed out credit cards to pay for everything. The constant international phone charges for texting updates home, the interpreter fees for legal documents, the extended hotel stay, it all added up to a devastating total. Through it all, I kept updating my family, hoping someone would offer more than brief condolences or practical suggestions. Looking back, I shouldn't have been surprised by their response to my airport text. My family had always operated this way. When I was diagnosed with profound hearing loss at 18 months, they attended appointments but never fully committed to learning ASL. Throughout my childhood, family conversations happened around me, not with me. I became expert at reading lips and context clues, filling in gaps with educated guesses, laughing at jokes I'd only partially understood. When I graduated high school as salutatorian, my parents attended but left immediately after my speech to get David to his baseball tournament. At my college graduation, they arrived late and left early, claiming they couldn't understand the sign language interpreter anyway. Even at my wedding, my mother spent more time fussing over Maya's last-minute outfit crisis than celebrating my marriage to a man who had learned her daughter's language fluently. I had spent my entire life accommodating their comfort level, making excuses for their minimal ASL vocabulary, and telling myself that family just had different ways of showing love. When conversations moved too fast for their limited signing skills, I'd switch to writing notes or simplified gestures. When they forgot to include me in group discussions, I'd pretend I hadn't noticed the isolation. Now, standing at my husband's grave on the other side of the world, I finally understood that some people simply don't have the capacity to enter your world, even when that world is the only way to truly know you. They expect you to exist in their language, on their terms, within their comfort zone, regardless of what that costs you. After the funeral, a whole new nightmare began. German bureaucracy required multiple certified copies of death certificates, each needing authentication at different government offices across Berlin. I spent 4 days shuttling between buildings in the February cold, standing in endless lines, trying to explain my situation through grief-choked words and frantic note-writing. Each night I collapsed in our rented apartment, surrounded by Marcus's clothes that still smelled like him, his laptop still logged into our shared accounts, his half-finished accessibility project still open on the screen. I would sit on the floor of his closet, holding his favorite sweater, signing into empty air about my day, about how lost I felt, about how much I missed our conversations. On my final morning in Berlin, I visited Marcus's grave one last time. The cemetery was peaceful at dawn, bare winter trees creating intricate shadows on the frost-covered ground. I placed fresh flowers beside his simple headstone daffodils, his favorite, bright yellow promises of spring he'd never see. I sat on the cold earth and signed him one final story. About the life we'd built together, the languages we'd shared, the children we'd planned to raise bilingual. About how he'd made me feel heard in a world that so often rendered me invisible. "I'll keep you alive in my heart," I signed, pressing my palm against the cold marble. "Every day, in every conversation, in every sign. You'll live in my hands forever." My journey home stretched over 36 hours. First, an 8-hour delay in Berlin due to a winter storm. Then, a missed connection in London requiring an overnight stay in a cramped airport hotel. The final leg included turbulence so severe that passengers were sick and crying around me, though I couldn't hear their distress. During those endless travel hours, exhaustion and grief created a strange, dissociative state. I kept reaching for my phone to text Marcus about the delays, kept looking around airports for familiar signs before remembering he'd never respond again. My world had become completely silent in ways beyond my deafness, the silence of a future erased, of conversations that would never happen, of dreams that died with him. By the time we began our descent into Seattle, I had been traveling for more than a day straight, had barely eaten, and was running on pure determination and the desperate need to be home. But as the plane touched down on American soil, a terrible realization hit me. Home wasn't home anymore. Marcus had been my home, and now I was just returning to a house full of memories and an empty future. During the taxi ride through customs, my phone battery died. My communication lifeline to the world simply went black. I managed to find a charging station and sent that final text to the family group chat: "Flight delayed. Landing 11 p.m. Need ride, phone dying, can't call Uber." Maya's response felt like a physical blow: "Can't pick you up that late. Figure it out." Mom's follow-up was even worse: "Why didn't you plan better? We have work tomorrow." David added, "Seriously, Jas, it's almost midnight. Use a ride app like everyone else." I stared at those messages in the harsh fluorescent lighting of baggage claim, surrounded by families reuniting with embraces and excited chatter I couldn't hear. My husband was dead, buried alone in a foreign country. I had just endured the worst week of my life, and my family couldn't be bothered to pick me up from the airport. I typed back no problem because that's what I'd been trained to do my entire life: accommodate their limitations, minimize my needs, pretend their neglect didn't cut me to the bone. Seattle-Tacoma International Airport buzzed with late-night activity as I made my way through customs. I stood at baggage claim watching suitcases circle endlessly. Mine were easy to identify, one large black case containing my clothes and two others packed with Marcus's possessions. The things I couldn't bear to leave behind: his favorite flannel shirt, the leather laptop bag I'd given him for our anniversary, photo albums from our travels, his coffee mug with the accessibility symbol that made him laugh every morning. Fragments of our life together that now represented everything I had left of him. My phone buzzed with another message in the family chat. I opened it hoping someone had reconsidered. Maya, seriously, you're 32. We can't rearrange our schedules last minute. This is why planning exists. Mom, your father and I have early meetings tomorrow. We need our rest at our age. Dad, weather looks bad tonight too. Drive carefully when you figure out transportation. I stared at the screen, a familiar hollow feeling spreading through my chest. Not even a question about how I was doing or if I had arrived safely. No acknowledgement of what I had just been through. I typed a simple "no worries, I understand," though I didn't understand at all how dinner meetings and sleep schedules could outweigh the need to support your daughter who had just buried her husband alone. The weight of the suitcases made me stagger as I loaded them onto a cart. Marcus's possessions suddenly felt impossibly heavy, both physically and emotionally. As I struggled toward the exit, one of the wheels stuck, sending the top suitcase crashing to the ground. It burst open, spilling Marcus's belongings across the polished airport floor. I dropped to my knees, frantically gathering his things as tears blurred my vision. His blue sweater, his running shoes, the tie he wore to fancy dinners, the small notebook where he practiced new ASL vocabulary. Each item I touched unleashed fresh waves of grief, but also panic. These were all I had left of him, scattered like debris in an anonymous airport. "Let me help you, A TSA agent knelt beside me, gently collecting scattered items. Her name tag read Carmen. She had kind eyes that crinkled at the corners, and when she saw my distress, her expression softened with genuine concern. "Are you all right?" she asked, then immediately began signing basic ASL. "You okay? Need help?" The simple question, asked in my language, broke something inside me. When was the last time someone had asked if I was all right in ASL? Not how soon I'd get over it, or what practical steps I needed to take, but simply if I was okay, signed with hands that cared enough to learn my language. "My husband died," I signed back, my hands shaking. "I just buried him in Germany. Alone." Carmen's expression filled with compassion. She helped me repack the suitcase carefully, treating Marcus's belongings with the reverence of sacred objects. When we finished, she personally escorted me to the rideshare pickup area. "Someone coming for you," she signed. I shook my head. "Family busy." Her frown spoke volumes, but she didn't comment. Instead, she waited with me until the Uber arrived, helped load my luggage, and squeezed my hand before I got in. "Take care," she signed. "You matter." It was more comfort than my own family had offered. The rideshare cost $89 due to late-night pricing, but I was beyond caring about money. The driver, an older Somali man named Hassan, made polite conversation until he realized I was deaf. Then he simply turned on soft music and drove in respectful silence, occasionally catching my eye in the rearview mirror with a gentle smile. As we navigated empty highways toward my neighborhood, I stared out at the familiar Seattle skyline and felt like a stranger in my own city. Nothing looked different, but everything had changed. Marcus would never again see these views, never again complain about traffic on this route, never again be waiting at home when I returned from a trip. After nearly an hour, we pulled into my driveway. The house sat dark and cold, exactly as I'd left it, yet completely transformed by loss. Marcus would never again open that front door, never again pull into this driveway, never again complain about the neighbor's dog barking at dawn, though I'd never minded that particular neighborhood sound. Hassan helped carry my luggage to the porch, and as he set down the last bag, he hesitated. Through a combination of gestures and phone translation, he conveyed, "You sure you okay? You seem like maybe you need someone." I assured him I was fine and tipped him generously, watching his taillights disappear down the street before fumbling with my house keys. My hands shook so badly it took several attempts to get the door open. I stepped into cold, stale air. The house felt like a mausoleum, preserved exactly as we'd left it, but drained of all life. I had asked Mom to adjust the thermostat before my return. She had apparently forgotten. The refrigerator hummed in the darkness, the only sound in a house that once rang with laughter and conversation in 2 languages. I dragged myself upstairs to our bedroom, but I couldn't bear to sleep in our bed. Everything was too much: the pillow that still held the indent of Marcus's head, the book he'd been reading before leaving for Germany, the framed photo of us on our honeymoon where his hands were signing forever while I laughed. Instead, I curled up in the armchair by the window, still wearing my coat because the house was so cold. Surrounded by photographs of happier times, I finally allowed myself to break down completely. In Germany, I'd had to be strong, functional, capable of handling bureaucracy and making impossible decisions. Here, in the chair where Marcus used to read while I worked late, I could finally fall apart. I woke hours later, disoriented and shivering. The house felt different in a way I couldn't initially identify. Then I realized it was the silence. Not just my familiar deafness, but a complete absence of the vibrations and visual cues that had always told me Marcus was near. No footsteps in the hallway, no lights left on in his office, no movement in the peripheral vision that meant I wasn't alone. I made my way downstairs to assess what my family had promised to handle during my absence. The mail basket overflowed with bills and condolences. Maya had assured me she'd collect it daily. The refrigerator contained only expired milk and something unidentifiable that had turned green with mold. David had promised to stock basic necessities for my return. But it was the temperature that concerned me most. My breath created visible clouds in the air. The smart thermostat, one of Marcus's accessibility installations that sent alerts to our phones, showed the heat hadn't run in days. The house was barely above freezing. I tried adjusting the system, but nothing happened. In the basement utility room, I found the problem. A pipe had burst, flooding the area around the water heater and apparently damaging the heating system as well. Water covered the floor, and ice had formed along the walls where cold air seeped through foundation cracks. The sight of the flooded basement should have prompted immediate action, but I felt paralyzed by the enormity of it. After everything else, Marcus's death, the funeral arrangements, the grueling travel, my family's abandonment, this felt almost comically cruel. Of course my homecoming would include a flooded house. Of course the one place I desperately needed to feel safe and warm would be uninhabitable. I stood in ankle-deep freezing water, staring at the destruction, feeling oddly detached from the crisis. My phone had been buzzing with weather alerts all day. A major winter storm was approaching Seattle, temperatures expected to drop well below freezing. My family must have known about the forecast when they told me to drive carefully, yet no one had thought to ensure the house was winterized or the heat was working. I climbed back upstairs and tried calling emergency repair services, but it was nearly 2 a.m., and most went straight to voicemail. The few that answered quoted astronomical emergency rates and couldn't guarantee arrival before the weekend. The storm was causing similar problems throughout the region. Desperate, I called Maya. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice thick with sleep and irritation. Jasmine, it's the middle of the night. What's wrong now? I tried to explain about the burst pipe and flooded basement, but she interrupted impatiently. Did you try turning the water off? Look, I can't deal with house problems right now. Call a plumber in the morning. Maya, I can't stay here. There's no heat and water in the electrical fixtures. The storm. So go to a hotel. You have insurance, right? I need to sleep. The line went dead. I stared at my phone, heart pounding with a mixture of desperation and disbelief. I tried David next. Jesus, Jas, do you know what time it is? His whisper was sharp with annoyance. Lisa just got the baby to sleep. I explained the situation as quickly as possible, but his response was immediate. That really sucks, but we can't have you here tonight. Lisa's parents are visiting, and honestly, we're all getting over a stomach bug. The last thing we need is houseguests. David, I just buried my husband. I've been traveling for 2 days straight. I can't stay in a house with no heat and flooded electrical systems. Look, I get that you're upset, but we all have our own problems. Check into a hotel and deal with the repairs tomorrow like a normal person." My parents' response was equally dismissive. Mom answered with immediate defensiveness, "Jasmine, we would normally help, but your father's blood pressure has been acting up, and we can't handle the stress of houseguests right now. Don't you have homeowners insurance for exactly this kind of situation?" By this point, I hadn't eaten a proper meal in over 30 hours. International travel, grief, and now this crisis had left me physically depleted. I felt lightheaded and nauseous as I tried to navigate the partially flooded kitchen to find anything edible. The power flickered ominously as the storm outside intensified. I managed to locate a package of stale crackers and ate them mechanically while standing in water that had soaked through my shoes and socks. My extremities were going numb from the cold, but I couldn't seem to care enough to find dry clothes. Everything felt distant and unimportant compared to the vast emptiness where Marcus used to be. The visual smoke detector in the hallway, another of Marcus's accessibility modifications, began flashing rapidly. I followed the alerts to discover that water had apparently damaged the heating system more severely than I'd realized. The basement was filling with a strange, chemical smell I could see but not identify through the vapor rising from the flooded area. In desperation, I decided to check the main electrical panel to see if I could at least restore partial power to one room. The basement stairs were slick with water, and I gripped the railing tightly as I made my way down. The concrete floor was now submerged under several inches of cold water that soaked through my jeans. I sloshed toward the electrical panel on the far wall, using my phone's flashlight to guide me. The metal box showed signs of water damage, but I couldn't tell how severe. As I reached to open the panel door, my foot slipped on the wet concrete. I fell forward, my hand instinctively bracing against the metal electrical box. A sharp jolt of electricity shot through my arm, throwing me backward into the flooded basement. My head struck something hard as I fell, and for a moment, everything went dark. When I regained consciousness, I was lying in freezing water on the basement floor, disoriented and shaking violently. My right arm tingled painfully from the electrical shock, and something warm trickled down the side of my face. When I touched my temple, my fingers came away red with blood. The fall had opened a gash just above my eyebrow, and my vision was blurry around the edges. I struggled to my feet, but the basement seemed to tilt and spin around me. Each step toward the stairs required immense concentration. Halfway up, I had to stop and sit, my vision blurring dangerously. The combination of hypothermia, electrical shock, and head trauma was creating a medical emergency, but I was completely alone. By the time I reached the main floor again, I was barely conscious. I collapsed onto the living room sofa, unable to go any further. The house had grown even colder, and I could no longer feel my fingers or toes. Some distant part of my mind recognized the symptoms of severe hypothermia setting in, but I couldn't summon the energy to care. My phone lay on the coffee table just inches from my hand, yet it might as well have been miles away. My limbs refused to cooperate, and darkness crept in at the edges of my vision. The visual alerts from various smart home devices were flashing throughout the house, carbon monoxide detectors, smoke alarms, temperature sensors, but the water damage had disrupted many of the systems, and I was too disoriented to interpret the warnings correctly. In what I believed might be my final conscious moments, a strange calm settled over me. If this was how it ended, at least I would be with Marcus again. At least the pain would stop. The isolation would end. The cruel indifference of my family would no longer matter. The last thing I remembered before losing consciousness completely was a rhythmic pounding on the front door and lights flashing through the windows. Then nothing but darkness. I later learned that Elena Rodriguez, my neighbor from 2 houses down, had been walking her dog during the storm when she noticed water flowing out from under my front door and down the porch steps. Elena was part of our local deaf community. She had a deaf teenage daughter and the whole family was fluent in ASL. Concerned, Elena had tried calling and texting first, then came over to investigate. When no one answered her knocks, but she could see the flashing alerts from multiple safety devices through the windows, she immediately called 911. The firefighters broke down the door to find me unconscious on the sofa, the house dangerously cold and partially flooded, with carbon monoxide levels well above the safety threshold. According to the paramedics who transported me to Seattle General Hospital, I was suffering from moderate hypothermia, carbon monoxide poisoning, a concussion, and the effects of electrical shock. A few more hours and we would have been looking at a very different outcome, one of them reportedly told the emergency room doctor. At the hospital, the medical team worked quickly to raise my body temperature and administer oxygen to counteract the carbon monoxide. They cleaned and stitched the gash on my temple, monitored my heart for arrhythmias caused by the electrical shock, and conducted neurological tests to assess the severity of my concussion. When they found my passport with recent German stamps and noticed my wedding ring, a compassionate nurse named Jennifer gently asked about my circumstances. She was one of the few hospital staff members who knew basic ASL enough to ask simple questions and understand my responses. In my semi-conscious state, I apparently told her everything: Marcus's death, the overseas funeral, my family's response to my request for airport pickup, and returning to a cold, neglected house. Jennifer documented it all in my medical chart, concerned about my complete lack of support system upon discharge. What neither of us knew was that a local reporter named Michael Torres was at the hospital covering storm-related injuries for the evening news. He overheard paramedics discussing my case in the break room, the tragic confluence of events that led to a newly widowed woman being found near death in her own home. The human interest angle was too compelling to ignore. Michael interviewed Elena, who shared that she had seen me arrive home by rideshare the previous evening. She looked completely exhausted, just drained, Elena told the camera in both spoken English and ASL. I meant to go welcome her back, but with the storm coming, I got busy preparing my own house. I feel terrible now knowing what she was going through alone. He also spoke with the paramedics who responded to the call. One of them, visibly moved by the situation, shared details of the text message exchange he had seen on my phone, which was still open to the family group chat when they found me. Here's someone who just lost her husband, asking her family for a simple ride from the airport, and they basically told her to figure it out herself, he said, shaking his head. Then she comes home to a house no one bothered to check on during a winter storm. It's just heartbreaking. By evening, the story had made it to the local news. Local woman returns from husband's overseas funeral to near tragedy. The report detailed how I had buried Marcus in Berlin, traveled over 30 hours to return home, been denied basic support from family members, and then nearly died due to a preventable household emergency. Social media amplified the story rapidly. Screenshots of the text exchange, shared by someone at the hospital, spread across local community groups and eventually reached wider platforms. The contrast between my simple request for help and my family's dismissive responses struck a chord with viewers. The hashtag #deafandabandoned began trending locally, with people sharing their own stories of family neglect during times of need and specifically discussing the additional barriers faced by deaf individuals during emergencies. Local businesses responded with offers of assistance. A plumbing company volunteered to repair my pipes at no cost. A restoration service offered to handle the water damage. A hotel chain provided a complimentary 2-week stay while repairs were completed. The Deaf Community Center organized meal deliveries and emotional support services. That evening, as the 10 o'clock news aired the story with footage of emergency vehicles outside my house, my family saw their private conversation broadcast for all to see. According to the night nurse who witnessed their arrival, Maya burst into my hospital room first, her face ashen with panic. "We just saw the news," she stammered. "They're making it sound like we abandoned you completely." Mom followed, immediately defensive before even acknowledging me. "This is a complete misrepresentation. We had no idea the house was in such bad condition. Jasmine knows we would have helped if we understood how serious the situation was." David stood silently by the door, scrolling through his phone, probably reading social media responses. Only when the nurse stepped out did he approach my bed and ask quietly, "Are you going to be okay?" It was the first genuine question any of them had asked since Marcus died. Within minutes of their arrival, my phone began ringing incessantly with calls from extended family members, family friends, and acquaintances who had seen the news report. My aunt Susan called Maya directly, demanding to know why no one had gone to the airport. Dad's business partner texted to express concern and offer assistance. The family's carefully maintained image of loving support was crumbling under public scrutiny. As I drifted in and out of medicated sleep, I could hear them in the hallway outside my room, arguing in hushed voices about damage control. Maya insisted they needed to get ahead of the story before it affected her professional reputation. Mom worried about what her book club would think. Dad suggested they simply move me to their house once I was discharged to show everyone they cared. Not once in their discussions did I hear genuine remorse or concern for my well-being. It was all about appearances, public perception, and their own discomfort. Even in this moment of crisis, they couldn't see beyond themselves to the daughter and sister who had nearly died alone. When the hospital social worker arrived the next morning to discuss my discharge plan, she brought news that the community support was continuing to grow. A local grief support group had reached out offering specialized services for deaf individuals. A meal delivery service had donated 2 weeks of prepared foods. Several neighbors had volunteered to help with household tasks during my recovery. "You have options," the social worker assured me, signing clearly as she spoke. "You don't have to go with your family if that's not what you want." It was the first time anyone had acknowledged that I had a choice, that I wasn't obligated to accept help wrapped in obligation and self-interest simply because it came from blood relatives. As my family hovered anxiously nearby, waiting to implement their damage control plan, I closed my eyes and thought of Marcus. He had always encouraged me to stand up for myself with them. "Your worth isn't determined by their ability to see it," he would sign during family gatherings where I'd been inadvertently excluded from conversations. "You don't have to make yourself smaller to accommodate their limitations." Now, lying in a hospital bed after nearly dying alone in our home, I finally understood what he meant. By morning, my condition had stabilized enough for longer periods of consciousness. The hospital room felt crowded with my family's performance. They had taken shifts through the night, ensuring someone was always visible by my bedside, particularly when medical staff entered the room. The act was flawless yet utterly hollow. Maya sat scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing up to ask if I needed anything before returning to what appeared to be social media damage control. Mom arranged and rearranged the few items on my bedside table, filling any silence with comments about how this whole situation has been blown completely out of proportion. David stood by the window, periodically sighing and checking his watch as if he had somewhere more important to be. When Dr. Chen entered to discuss my condition and discharge options, Mom immediately transformed, her voice softening as she touched my arm. "We're just so grateful she's all right. Of course, our family sticks together during difficult times." Dr. Chen nodded professionally while reviewing my chart. "Mrs. Lambert has experienced significant trauma, both physical and emotional. Her recovery will require rest, proper nutrition, warm surroundings, and minimal stress." He looked directly at me, not my mother, as he spoke. "What support system do you have in place, Jasmine?" Before I could answer, Maya jumped in. "She has us. We're her family." There was just a misunderstanding about her arrival time yesterday, which the media has completely distorted. Dr. Chen maintained his professional demeanor, switching between spoken English and basic ASL as he addressed me directly. "I see. And will someone be available to monitor you continuously for the next 48 hours? The concussion requires observation, and you shouldn't be left alone." "Of course," Mom replied smoothly. "We've already prepared the guest room. I can rearrange my schedule to stay home." A nurse named Jessica entered with my medication and breakfast tray. She was fluent in ASL. I learned later she had deaf parents and had been caring for me since early morning. She had witnessed my family's performance shift whenever medical staff entered the room. As she checked my vitals, she quietly signed, "Are you comfortable with this plan, Jasmine? Because there are alternatives if you need them." Mom stiffened. "Alternatives?" "She's coming home with her family where she belongs." Jessica met my eyes steadily, ignoring Mom's interjection. "The choice is yours," she signed simply. In that moment, something shifted inside me. The choice was mine. Not what would make my family look good in the media, not what would preserve their social standing, but what I actually needed to heal. I took a deep breath. "I would like to hear about the alternatives," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in weeks. The room fell silent. Maya stopped typing mid-text. Mom's mouth opened and closed without sound. David turned from the window with a frown of disbelief. Jasmine, Mom finally managed, you can't be serious. After everything we've done. What exactly have you done? The question escaped me before I could reconsider. But once spoken, I couldn't take it back. Nor did I want to. When Marcus was dying, you were too busy to come. When I buried him alone, you said flights were too expensive. When I needed a ride from the airport after 36 hours of travel, you suggested rideshare apps. When I called about the burst pipe, you prioritized work meetings and sleep schedules. My voice remained calm, factual, rather than accusatory. So please, tell me what you've done that entitles you to control my recovery now that people are watching. Maya stood abruptly. That's completely unfair. We didn't know how serious. You didn't ask, I interrupted, my hands moving as I spoke. Not once did any of you ask how I was really doing. Not once did you offer genuine help without excuses attached. You didn't need to see me on the news to know I was grieving and alone. You chose not to see it. Mom's face flushed with indignation. We've always supported you, Jasmine. Perhaps not in the exact way you wanted, but families can't drop everything for every crisis. Your expectations are simply unrealistic. Needing a ride from the airport after burying my husband is an unrealistic expectation? I asked quietly, hoping someone might have checked that the heat was working in my house during a winter storm was asking too much. We're busy people, Maya insisted. We can't be expected to remember every little detail. Every little detail, I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. Like whether your newly widowed sister might freeze to death in her own home. David finally spoke, his voice subdued. Jasmine, we understand you're upset. Grief can make people say things they don't mean. When you're thinking more clearly. I am thinking more clearly than I have in years, I interrupted. For the first time, I see our family dynamic without making excuses for it. I see that I've spent my entire life accepting scraps of attention and convincing myself it was love. Jessica had remained in the room, quietly arranging my medications. Her presence somehow gave me strength to continue. I don't hate you, I said, looking at each of them in turn. I don't even blame you for being who you are. But I will no longer pretend that you can give me what I need right now, or that you would even if you could. So what are you saying? Maya demanded. You'd rather stay with strangers than your own family. I'm saying I choose to prioritize my healing over maintaining our family's image. I choose to surround myself with genuine support rather than obligation disguised as care. The social worker, Ms. Patterson, entered with a folder of information. My family fell silent, aware of how a continued argument might appear to hospital staff. Ms. Patterson explained the community resources that had been arranged, a 2-week stay at the Cascade Inn while my home was repaired, meal delivery services, transportation to medical appointments, and connection to a grief support group specifically for deaf individuals that met twice weekly. Several neighbors have also volunteered to check in regularly, she added, signing as she spoke. And the restoration company working on your house has offered to install updated accessibility features and a security system with remote monitoring to prevent future emergencies. The contrast between this outpouring from strangers and my family's reluctant, image-conscious support couldn't have been more stark. While my family stared in stunned silence, I accepted the arrangements presented by Ms. Patterson. This is ridiculous, Maya finally sputtered. You're choosing random people over your own blood. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time. I'm choosing kindness over obligation. I'm choosing to value myself enough to accept help that comes without conditions or resentment. Mom gathered her purse, her movements stiff with indignation. When you come to your senses, we'll be waiting. But don't expect us to drop everything again when you decide you need us. That's exactly my point, I replied softly. I never could expect that, and now I no longer will. As they filed out of the room, David lingered briefly at the door. For a moment, I thought he might say something meaningful, something that acknowledged the truth of what had happened. Instead, he simply shook his head once before following Mom and Maya. Jessica approached my bedside after they left. That took incredible courage, she signed, adjusting my pillows. Setting boundaries with family is one of the hardest things to do, especially when you're vulnerable. It doesn't feel like courage, I admitted. It feels like giving up. You're not giving up, she corrected gently. You're giving yourself permission to heal without carrying their emotional baggage too. There's a big difference. That afternoon, representatives from the various community services came to coordinate my discharge plan. The hotel manager assured me that everything was prepared for my arrival, including visual alert systems and TTY capabilities. The restoration company showed me photos of the initial work they'd done to prevent further damage to my home. The meal service coordinator discussed dietary preferences and delivery schedules, all conducted in fluent ASL. Each interaction reinforced what Jessica had said. This wasn't about rejecting family. It was about accepting genuine support without having to earn it or apologize for needing it. It was about recognizing that sometimes the family we're born into cannot provide what we need, and that's not a failure on our part. By evening, I was settled in a comfortable, accessible suite at the Cascade Inn overlooking Elliott Bay. The room was warm, the bed soft, and a refrigerator had been stocked with nourishing foods. On the desk sat a potted plant with a card signed by hospital staff who had cared for me, along with contact information for local deaf community resources. For the first time since Marcus died, I felt something besides grief and abandonment. It wasn't happiness that seemed impossibly distant still. But perhaps it was the first fragile seedling of peace. I had stood in my truth, honored my needs, and discovered that there was kindness in the world beyond the narrow confines of familial obligation. As I watched the sunset paint Elliott Bay in shades of gold and pink, I signed to Marcus as if he could see me. I think you'd be proud of me today. I finally did what you always said I should. I could almost see his response, his hands moving in the graceful ASL that had first captured my heart. I've always been proud of you. It was yourself you needed to make proud. 3 months passed in a blur of slow, steady healing. My physical recovery progressed more quickly than expected. The concussion symptoms faded after several weeks of rest. The electrical burn on my hand left only a faint mark that the doctor assured me would eventually disappear completely. The gash on my temple healed into a thin silver line, partly hidden by my hairline. The emotional healing proved more challenging but equally possible. With the help of the grief support group that met at the Seattle Deaf Center every Tuesday and Thursday, I began to process not only the loss of Marcus but also the complicated feelings surrounding my family relationships. The group facilitator, Dorothy, was a deaf woman in her 60s who had lost her own hearing husband 5 years earlier. She had a gentle way of asking questions that helped me see patterns without judgment. Grief has a way of clarifying what truly matters, Dorothy often signed. It strips away pretense and forces us to confront truth, both beautiful and painful. My house transformation mirrored my internal one. The restoration company not only repaired the water damage but made improvements I'd never considered. They installed a comprehensive visual alert system, replaced the aging water heater with a smart model I could monitor remotely, and reinforced the plumbing system against future freezing. What began as destruction became an opportunity for renewal. Throughout this process, neighbors I'd barely known before became regular fixtures in my life. Elena from down the street brought homemade tamales every Sunday, always remembering to text before arriving so I'd see the visual doorbell alert. Robert and Kim from across the street helped reinstall my garden beds when the yard work was completed. Maria, a deaf retired teacher from the neighborhood, simply sat with me on difficult days when signs weren't necessary but presence was essential. My family maintained a careful distance. Occasional text messages arrived, superficially pleasant but lacking any acknowledgement of our hospital room confrontation. Mom sent a generic thinking of you card signed by all 3 of them. Maya called once, ostensibly to check on me, but really to mention that her clients had seen the news story and she wanted to clarify any misconceptions. David sent an email with links to home security information, his only concession that anything significant had happened. I responded politely but briefly to each contact, no longer expecting deeper connection or understanding. The boundary I'd established in the hospital remained firm, not as punishment but as protection for my healing heart. I couldn't afford to deplete my limited emotional resources on relationships that consistently took more than they gave. 6 months after Marcus's death, I established the Marcus Lambert Memorial Foundation for Emergency Accessibility. Using the life insurance funds that had finally been processed, I created an organization dedicated to improving emergency response systems for deaf and disabled individuals. The foundation's first initiative addressed the exact problems I'd faced, developing partnerships between hospitals and interpreter services, creating visual alert systems for emergency situations, and training first responders in basic ASL and disability awareness. Working on the foundation gave me purpose during the darkest hours of grief. Each program I developed reflected a lesson learned through painful experience. Each improvement represented a barrier that future deaf individuals might not have to face alone. Marcus had always been passionate about accessibility technology. This felt like the perfect way to honor his memory while transforming my pain into something meaningful. On what would have been our 9th anniversary, I hosted a small gathering at my rebuilt home to announce the foundation's first major grant recipient. Close friends who had supported me through everything joined the celebration, along with new friends made during my recovery journey. My family received invitations but sent regrets, citing prior commitments. As I presented the grant certificate to the Seattle Fire Department for their new ASL training program, I felt Marcus's presence more strongly than I had since his death. Not as a ghost or supernatural visitation, but as the enduring impact of the love we had shared. His influence remained in how I approached challenges, in my capacity for resilience, and in my ability to create meaning from suffering. This foundation exists because of a great love and a profound loss, I told the small audience gathered in my living room, my hands painting the words as I spoke. But also because of an unexpected lesson that family can be found in the most surprising places, formed not necessarily by blood but by who shows up when showing up matters most. The following week, I received a letter from David. An actual handwritten letter, something I'd never received from him before. Unlike the superficial communications of previous months, this one contained something rare: reflection. "I've been thinking about what happened after you returned from Germany," he wrote. "While Maya and Mom may never see it clearly, I want you to know that I recognize our failure. Not just in the practical matters of airport rides and house maintenance, but in the deeper obligation to provide comfort during your darkest hours. I realize now that we've spent your entire life expecting you to accommodate our limitations instead of making any real effort to enter your world. We never learned your language, not really. We never made the effort that a real family should make. The man you married would be proud of the woman you've become in his absence. Perhaps someday, if you're willing, we might find a way forward, not as we were, but as we could be." I didn't respond immediately. The letter required contemplation, not reaction. I discussed it with my therapist, who had been helping me navigate grief and family dynamics for several months. "What do you want from a relationship with your brother?" she asked. "Not what you think you should want, or what might make him feel better, but what would actually serve your well-being." The question stayed with me for days. Eventually, I wrote back with clear boundaries and expectations. I expressed willingness for occasional one-on-one meetings with him, with the understanding that these would be exploratory, not obligatory. Any relationship moving forward would be based on mutual respect and genuine connection, not performance or obligation. Most importantly, he would need to commit to learning conversational ASL, not just basic signs, but enough to have real conversations in my language. To my surprise, he agreed to these terms without argument. He enrolled in ASL classes at the community college and began practicing with online resources. Our first coffee meeting was awkward but civil. His signing was elementary, but he was trying, really trying, for perhaps the first time in my life. The second meeting was slightly less stilted. By the third, we had found a careful rhythm of communication that acknowledged our history without being defined by it. It wasn't the close sibling bond some might envy, but it was authentic in a way our previous relationship had never been. David was making an effort to know me in my language, and that meant everything. Maya and Mom maintained their distance, occasionally sending holiday cards or impersonal gifts, but never addressing the fundamental issues that had led to our estrangement. I accepted this as their choice and focused my energy on relationships that nourished rather than depleted me. A year after Marcus's death, I stood at SeaTac Airport waiting for a flight that would take me back to Berlin to visit his grave on the anniversary. As I watched families reunite around me, the embraces, the excited chatter in multiple languages, the genuine joy of Reconnect Ion, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was still sadness for what my own family could not provide, but no longer the desperate longing of before. I had learned that family could be created and chosen. That support could come from unexpected sources. That boundaries weren't walls but healthy filters that allowed good in while keeping harm at bay. Most importantly, I had learned that my worth wasn't determined by others' ability to recognize it. As I boarded the plane, I thought about how differently this journey felt from my return trip a year ago. Then I had been broken by grief and abandonment, desperate for connection and support that never came. Now I carried within me a community of care that existed regardless of physical proximity, people who had shown up when it mattered most, people who continued to show up day after day in ways both large and small. The greatest lesson from that terrible homecoming wasn't about my family's failures or the painful consequences that followed. It was about the remarkable capacity of human beings to step forward and hold space for each other's pain. About the healing power of being truly seen in your darkest moments. About the family we create when the one we were born into cannot meet our needs. If you have ever felt invisible when you needed support most, please know that you are not alone. Your worth isn't determined by others' capacity to recognize it. Sometimes the people we expect to be there for us simply cannot provide what we need due to their own limitations, not our lack of value. The challenge is to remain open to unexpected sources of care and connection, even when previous experience makes that openness feel dangerous. What unexpected sources of support have you discovered during difficult times? Have you ever been surprised by kindness from strangers when those closest to you couldn't provide what you needed? Have you ever had to set boundaries with family to protect your own well-being? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share to help others who might be feeling alone in their struggles. Remember that your story matters, your boundaries are valid, and healing is always possible, sometimes in ways we never could have imagined. Thank you for being part of this journey with me.